Today, I'm going to talk about my training plan for the 2020 Houston Marathon. 2.2 miles, 9 minutes, 15 seconds per mile, with an average heart rate of about 135 beats per minute today. A very, very short recovery run today. Mostly short because I just ran out of time. I forgot that we had to go to the costume shop today to get last minute things for our costumes to go trick-or-treating in the neighborhood today. So had to cut the run very, very short, unfortunately, because it was just such a beautiful day. But sometimes life does get in the way of training, which may be the most appropriate thing to happen to me talking about training plan for the Houston Marathon today. Now, it's very soon to be getting back into another marathon training block. I know that, but I wanted to give breaking that 3-hour barrier another shot in a relatively close amount of time. I didn't want to wait all the way until April. We'll see if that turns out to be a prudent thing or not, but in terms of how I plan on getting there, here is the 12-week plan that I'm kind of loosely putting together. And I've put it together on a Google Calendar, and I'll put a link in the description in case you want to take a look at it any closer. Keep in mind, I'm not a coach. I'm not wanting to be anyone's coach, but I know a lot of you guys are asking a lot of questions about what I'm doing, when I'm doing it. You can see on Strava kind of what I actually end up doing. But in terms of what my plan is, just to kind of see where my head's at, here is the Google Calendar where I put together a 12-week training plan. Now, I like 12-week training blocks for myself personally, because I'm generally in general good health and shape going into a plan. If I were out of shape or if I hadn't been running for a little while, I think 12 weeks would be way too short. But especially since I'm coming off another marathon training block, another 12 weeks I think is fine. 10 weeks of work, 2 weeks of taper is my general kind of outline. That's how I like 12 weeks. That's where I come up with that number. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, two things to keep in mind is one, that I'm trying low heart rate training. And so that's going to affect kind of my speed and paces for a little while. And I want to give that a couple more weeks to kind of get going, see how that's working. And that's going to bleed into this marathon training plan, which I decided to try this low heart rate training approach after I'd already signed up for this marathon. So again, some things are kind of coinciding, which may make both this marathon training block less optimal and also makes low heart rate training, at least testing that and figuring that out, less optimal as well. But we're going to kind of just go with it for now. The other kind of main thing to keep in mind for me in all this is that I really find that the Tanda Race Predictor is a pretty accurate predictor in terms of where my training should ultimately be. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Tanda Race Predictor, the basic premise behind it is you can run any goal time that you want with any amount of weekly miles that you want. But if you want to run a lot of slow miles, or if you are slower, you're gonna have to run a lot of miles to, say, run 3 hours for the marathon. If you don't want to run that many miles per week, or can't run that many miles per week for time consideration reasons, you can still run that 3-hour marathon with less mileage, but those miles have to average to be faster. And that's including warm-up miles, working miles, easy miles, all that put together, you average that out. So you put in your age, your gender, a recent race performance, and then you can, with sliders, figure out, all right, if I'm running 70 miles per week, then my weekly average for all of those miles for about an 8-week period or 4 to 8 week period. I'm not exactly sure how strict it is to go all the way to the 8 weeks of calculations. I've usually been using 4 when I do use the predictor. It tells you, like, okay, if you're running 70 miles per week, for example, at 7 minutes and 53 seconds per mile on average for all of your miles, that'll give you a time of 2:59:51. And so that's kind of the ultimate other, like, kind of bookend. Like, however I get there, I really want to be able to get there. Now, if I can get there by, at least a couple of weeks into this marathon training plan, running most of my miles at low heart rate, it's somewhere around the 8-minute per mile mark, then this marathon training plan is going to be very different. And I'm going to try doing low heart rate training all the way pretty much to the end, except for maybe weeks 9 and 10, the last 2 peak weeks of the plan. And it'll just be almost all low heart rate training. I don't think my body's going to adapt to low heart rate training that quickly. I'm only about a week into it. And the yesterday's run, which you guys will see tomorrow, just the way that the video footage is going to end up working out. That was a longer run. It went a little bit better. I'll talk to you guys more about it there. But overall, I'm averaging like in the mid 9s per mile for my low heart rate training miles. And so I don't imagine that I'm going to change in terms of my respiratory rate efficiency or my aerobic efficiency so that I'm running 8-minute miles or even 8-minute 30 seconds per mile in a month. So at a certain point, I'm going to have to transition over from pure low heart rate training to something that's going to look more like 80-20 or polarized training. And so this week 1 will be a 60-mile week, all low heart rate training. Last week I had in the mid 50s in terms of mileage, so it's not going to be too much of a jump up. Next week it'll be 65 miles, all low heart rate training, so 100% low heart rate. Week 3 and 4, they'll be starting my 70-mile weeks, because that'll put me 8 weeks out in terms of amount of work for the Tandem Race Predictor purposes. And so that'll all be low heart rate miles, so 70 miles that week, weeks 3 and week 4 at low heart rate training. So then we'll see how low heart training kind of my body responds to that. At week 5 through 7, that's where I anticipate that I'm going to have to kind of leave pure low heart rate training, or at least Maffetone style training, and go to more of a polarized model. It won't be exactly 80-20, because I'm only going to start incorporating speed work. And I'll say speed work because it's going to be half marathon pace miles and some marathon pace miles in my Saturday long run, and kind of the speed play type of workout that I normally like to do, which is really long rest periods, shorter intervals like miles or 2-mile intervals. And you can see that exactly how I'm breaking it up in the calendar. But for example, it'll be for that first week where I start to introduce some faster running. It'll be a little bit running, a warm up, a couple of miles, and then 1 half marathon pace mile, a mile of easy back at lower heart rate, another half marathon pace mile, another easy mile, and then turning it back around. Then I'll have, I think, either 1x2 or 1x3, something like that, of marathon pace miles, just to kind of get my body accustomed to that again after weeks of only low heart rate training. So I'm going to slowly start to introduce that over the next 3 weeks, to have some of those in my like 15-mile runs, 17-mile runs, have something a little bit longer, but with a couple of or a few fast miles in there. So at week 5, weeks 5 through 7, I'll have about 10% of my weekly miles at something a little bit of a greater intensity. I'm not sure exactly when you're doing that calculation, if you're doing 80-20 calculations, if that mile interval of rest between like the half marathon pace miles or the marathon pace miles, if that counts as high intensity or low intensity. If it does, I'm going to be more than 10. If it doesn't, I'm going to be at 10. Weeks 8, 9, and 10, it starts ratcheting up. 8, 9, and 10 are going to be my 20-mile weeks. I'll have 3 20-milers in a row. That'll be tough. So I might adjust this when I get there, depending on how my body's feeling with all this increased mileage. But I'll have the same number of half marathon pace miles, just a handful, 2 on each of those Saturdays, and then a marathon pace miles, so longer blocks and more of them of marathon pace miles. We may tweak it, may break it up to like a couple of 3-mile sessions, or one longer 5 or 6 mile marathon pace block within that 20-mile run. I'll have to just adjust it and play it by ear. I don't like the idea of writing like on day 1 what kind of like the workouts are going to be for the next 12 weeks or 10 weeks. Just because I'm not experienced enough in writing marathon plans to know how my body's going to respond to certain things. And I'm trying new things, so I have no idea how my body will be able to respond to some of that stuff. But at week 8, I'll be at about 20% of my work will be higher intensity, same with week 9. By week 10, I'll be closer to 25% of my weekly volume, depending if I stay at 70 miles or I bump up that to like 75. I'll be about 20 to 25% weekly miles at a higher intensity. Nothing going to be faster this training block than half marathon paces, kind of what I'm thinking. That'll probably be the fastest that I go. And that'll be a very small part of it. Most of it will be more specifically tuned to marathon paces or in terms of the faster work, but the vast majority of it's going to be at hopefully low heart rate. We'll see how that goes. Again, as we get closer, depending on how fast I actually can run those low heart rate miles, we'll see how much I need to tweak it, because at the end of the day, I still want to be at that Tanda Race Predictor kind of goal of 70 miles per week at 7 minutes 53 seconds per mile on average for all my working miles. So that'll be something that I need to kind of figure out. The other thing that I'll be introducing in the last 3 weeks of training is some tempo-ish runs. And they're not really tempo runs because they're going to be too slow to be tempo. But again, it's something else to introduce some higher turnover as I transition out of like pure lower heart rate training and get more ready for the race. And those will be 8 mile days on Thursdays. Starting the first Thursday will be basically 2 by 3 mile intervals with a mile of rest in between. I know it's a long rest, but I like the long rest because it's just easier for watch recording purposes, because I don't have to worry about programming the watch, hitting a lap timer or whatever. It just auto laps on the mile, and that's just easier for me. Plus, it gives my heart more of a chance to kind of get back to a calmer level before I start the next interval. And that way focusing more of the work on an aerobic level versus an anaerobic level, at least in theory. And that's how I've broken up interval work within longer runs in the past. So I'm going to kind of try that again. But the first time I go back to it, it'll be 2 by 3 miles with the working intervals at like a 7:30 pace. Nice and easy, 7:20, about 30 seconds off my goal marathon pace. And then the next week will be 2 by 3 miles at marathon pace. And then the final week, in the peak week, will be 2 by 3 miles at half marathon pace. So getting me a little bit faster, working me a little bit harder, and getting more of that turnover. So that's where the tempo runs will come in. I'll only have 3 this training block, and none of them will actually be at tempo pace. They'll all be much slower. And then the other thing that I'm going to add to this training block that's going to be new, and I'm going to have that for the next 10 weeks throughout the training plan, is leg work in the gym. I'm still researching and figuring it out. I'm not sure what that leg workout's going to be. There'll be a separate video on that basically once I figure that out. But I'm only going to do it once a week. That's probably not a ton, but I also don't want to overdo it in terms of I'm adding in a lot of new different things. And so like just introduce myself to strength training in the gym once a week. I'll probably just do the same workout every week. What that exact workout will be, I don't know. It's going to get tweaked here and there until I kind of figure out what like feels right, what exercises I like. 2 exercises that I have on my list right now that I absolutely hate because I always feel like they're hurting my joints in a certain way are leg curls and leg extensions. I do have them on my list. I'm going to try them again, give them another shot, figure out ways to make that work for me. But even when I did those in college, they never felt great. I never enjoyed doing them. So if I can, I might replace that with weights of some sort, but rather than using a machine, And so we'll see how that goes. I'm going to do only about 3 sets per each exercise, low amount of reps, usually in the 6 to 8, but in no event no more than 10. Lots of rest in between, about a minute rest in between sets. So it's going to take a while to get through all these. I'm going to try and tune it so it doesn't take more than like 45 minutes to an hour in terms of leg work. And I'll still have a run on leg days. So that way those days will be kind of doubles, even though I'll be running only once. So that's my overall plan. It's ambitious, I think. It's putting a lot of load back on my system really quickly. I'm hoping with all these low heart rate miles, though, that my body will be able to gradually adapt to it. I'll be introducing leg work first in terms of weights. And then after weeks of that and weeks of higher mileage, then we'll start introducing some faster miles in terms of wrapping that in my longer runs. So just a little bit of speed play. And then towards the last 3 weeks, then we'll get to more tempo-ish style runs, depending on how the speed play miles go in the earlier weeks, in the middle weeks. That may actually get closer to tempo miles, but for now I'm a little bit concerned about what my speed is going to be like. So starting that off slow, and I'll never actually get to tempo pace in those miles. So playing around with a lot of stuff, experimenting, blending from a lot of things that have worked for me in prior marathon training blocks, higher mileage, doing some speed work. So we'll see how that goes. The plan will be adjusted and adapted as we go. So you can always click on the link in the description to see kind of have I made any changes since kind of day one, and see what adaptations I've made. I'll check in with you guys once we switch over to starting to add in some of those faster miles. We'll check in with my heart rate and how that's going for my easy miles, and there'll be updates for sure. So hit the subscribe button if you want to follow along to see how this kind of weird experiment ends up playing out. Before I go, I do want to remind you guys about the charity runner for this week. This week it's Will Fernandez, who's going to be running the New York City Marathon in just a couple of days, and he's raising money for the MEB Foundation. I was very happy to donate $70 to his fundraising efforts, and I'll post a link in the description in case you'd like to learn more. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Yo, what's going on?